My name is Frederiksen, and I'll be talking about PESTO, proactively secure distributed single sign-on, or how to trust a hacked server. This is a joint work with Carsten Baum, Hesse, Anja Lehmann, and Avishay Yanai. So basically what we are looking at in this work is we're looking at the setting of federated identity management, where a user wishes to access multiple service providers online using a centralized identity provider or IDP in order to manage its identity online. Concretely, we can think of the IDP as, for example, Facebook and a service provider like Netflix. So what happens is that when a user wishes to access the service provider, such as Netflix, it signs in to the identity provider and receives a token in return, which it can pass on to the service provider. This token contains a proof from the identity provider that the user has a certain identity and that wishes to sign on to this specific service provider. This can, of course, be done with different service providers such as Spotify, where a different token is constructed. There's a lot of standardization of this, such as OpenID Connect or OAuth. And this is also sometimes being called single sign-on, although single sign-on is something slightly different. It has the advantage that passwords don't need to be stored by easy service providers. That is, the user does not really need to trust the specific service provider. It only needs to trust its IDP. The user only needs to remember a single password now, only the one it uses for the IDP, and there's no need for storing cryptographic secret on the user side, like would otherwise be the case in case certificates are used. The downside of this is, of course, that we now have a centralized authority that we put a lot of trust in. So this IDP can now, for example, impersonate the user towards any service provider. And we also need to trust it with the user's master password, which, even though the user might not use it other places online, could, for example, also be used by the user for full disk encryption. There are some other issues, but these are the main issues we're tackling in the talk today. Basically, the fact that the IDP becomes sort of a centralized target, even if it is not corrupted. So how do we usually solve a problem of a centralized authority that has too much trust? Well, we use distribution. So instead of having a single IDP, we consider several partial IDPs together, becoming what we call a virtual IDP. So this could, for example, be Facebook, Apple, and Google. Companies we might not completely trust on their own, but which we put enough trust in that they will not collude with each other in a malicious way in order to compromise us. So we only need one of them to basically be good, not all of them. In order to then achieve this solution for a virtual IDP, we need to execute basically two different steps. First, we need a distributed password authentication, and secondly, we need a distributed token generation. We're not the first ones looking at the setting. There's been a lot of work in distributed password authentication, in particular with password distributed or threshold password authentication, resulting in an exchange of keys or a secret share. And basically from this, we actually note that if the token, it's okay that it's just a key or a shared secret, then we're basically done. However, we do really want to come up with a solution that is compatible with OpenID Connect from the point of view of service providers. That is, so that we are able to basically integrate this more secure solution into an already existing framework where the service providers can be agnostic to the fact that distributed IDPs are used. Actually, there has been work on this before by Agrawal et al. From Visa Research. They introduced a work called PESTO, which allows for generation of arbitrary tokens, in particular, that are compatible with standards. And it's their work we take a point of departure in and try to make some improvements upon, which I will return to at the end of this talk. But first, I would actually like to mention what it is we're doing. So considering the first step of distributed password authentication, we consider a special PRF that is executed distributedly. This PRF is queried on a username and a password, which is of course known by the user, and a key, which is distributed between the different partial IDPs. So one thing that's also a bit special with this one is that we actually want the username to also be known by the partial IDPs in order to prevent online attacks where an attacker who has access to different IP addresses wants to try to brute force a specific user's account. In this way, they will be able to see how many attempts are made on a specific user and whether they're successful or not. So basically, what is resulting of this this PRF is a value y, which can be used later on. But it should also be mentioned that this special PRF is doable and is not very super inefficient. And we have given it a name, basically partially blind distributed oblivious PRF. And we show how to realize this based on bilinear maps. And this is basically a compilation of different approaches to these sort of distributed special PRFs, which we have combined to suit our needs. So given this value y, we derive a public-private key pair for the user. So remember that this value y is actually high entropy since it's based on keys from each of the partial IDPs along with the user's password. So after the user generates these keys, it can use the secret key to sign a nonce or basically a challenge from the IDPs, which it can send back. So during registration, it will also send back the public key, so they have a record on the user, basically. But this, again, since it's based on keys from all the IDPs, would be independent of the user's password and not brute forceable in an offline case. When the user wishes to sign in again, it will simply return this signature for the specific session, and the partial IDPs will be able to verify that the user actually knew its password. Then for the distributed token generation, we basically use some standard approaches, which has already been done quite a lot in regards to distributing RSA or ECDSA, specifically in our implementation, and in the rest of the protocol, we are focused on using RSA, since the partial signing of each partial IDP is the same basically as regular RSA. And since the operation required by the user to combine these shares into a proper signature is just multiplication. So with this signature, basically we can construct a token that can be sent to a service provider, which can be compatible with OpenID Connect or other standards such as SAML. So I mentioned that we are trying to compare our work or improving upon the previous work of PESTO. And here's a nice table that sort of outlines how we are we're managing up against this. So if we look at the efficiency, we see that our implementation is not as efficient. We require more exponentiations and one more round. However, on the plus side, which is what we are focused on in this work, is the general security, where we managed to get fully adaptive UC security, which means that the protocol can be composed arbitrarily with other protocols, and that it supports an attack model where the attacker can come and go, can come later on and decide who to corrupt. It doesn't need to be decided from the beginning. We also managed to both protect directly against online attack and offline attacks, whereas PESTO requires an extra round in order to protect against online attacks, that is, trying to brute force a specific user's username and password. We also managed to require less secure storage on the server, since we only require keys dependent on the amount of partial IDPs, whereas PESTO requires the amount proportional to the amount of users. But finally, and this is the key point we have been trying to achieve with this work, is to provide proactive security, which means that the keys of the servers can be refreshed as the protocol carries on. So this means that even if all but one of these partial IDPs get compromised, have their key material lost, it's still possible to get back to a secure state by executing such a refresh protocol without any interaction or awareness by the user. The price of this is that we only can do this in a distributed manner and not for an arbitrary threshold. Finally, we implemented this in Java and ran this with experiments across Europe at different AWS instances, where we see we get a reasonable, although high latency, but this is a full REST implementation that works. And here we have the numbers for the cryptographic values. That is the heavy part. Thank you for your time.